Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on, well, some pretty crucial global topics.
And today, we're really diving into the deep end with China's economic model. It's fascinating, it's complex.
We're using excerpts from the New China Playbook by Keyu as our guide.
Right. And our goal really is to kind of peel back the layers, get beyond the headlines, the stereotypes.
Understand what actually makes it tick. It's not pure capitalism, it's not traditional socialism. It's something else.
Exactly. Something defined by paradox, driven by some surprising forces, and profoundly shaped by its people, its history.
So get ready for some insights that might just challenge how you think about China.
To really get a feel for the transformation, you almost have to, mentally time travel. Go back to 1978.
What was the picture then?
Well, the source paints it as, frankly, a backward country. In shambles, really. After years of turmoil, poverty was just crushing.
And rationing was a thing, right?
Yeah.
Food coupons?
Oh, yeah. Food rationing was just life. Those little paper coupons. Decades later, people started collecting them. Symbols of just how scarce things were.
And then, fast forward, it feels like overnight, historically speaking.
It really does. Suddenly, you have hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. China becomes this absolutely central piece of the global economy.
An indispensable piece. The scale of change is just staggering.
It truly is. And the source points to these seismic shifts becoming really visible after 1997 or so.
What kind of shifts?
You had this incredible buzz around the reforms, the bid for the Olympics, joining the World Trade Organization.
WTO, right?
Yeah, big internal debates about privatization, adopting Western tech cars, infrastructure, business models. Everything seemed to be changing.
I bet the political theory textbooks needed constant rewriting.
Oh, constantly. This whole idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics was evolving in real time.
And for ordinary people.
A level of comfort, material well-being that previous generations could barely have imagined. The author mentions just being stunned, seeing Beijing's skyline transform each summer. Not just new buildings, like whole new cityscapes appearing.
It's a world away from maybe the lingering image some might have outside China?
Absolutely. Today, you've got smart cities, autonomous vehicle lanes, robots serving you KFC. It's different.
And this incredible speed, this transformation, it throws up these core paradoxes, doesn't it?
That's exactly it. How does this powerful, centralized Communist Party preside over what looks, for all the world, like a thriving capitalist engine?
Right. And how do you get this intense entrepreneurial drive alongside, well, a culture that often emphasizes deference to authority?
Those are the big questions, the puzzles we need to sort of unpack.
Okay, so let's get into that mechanism. The party's there, the market's booming.
Yeah.
How does it actually work together?
The source describes it as this really clever combination. You've got strong state guidance from the top at the macro level, setting the big strategic goals.
A national direction.
Yeah. But then, paired with that, you have really dynamic market forces operating at the micro level. Businesses competing, innovating, adapting.
So it's this hybrid approach that fueled the growth.
Fundamentally. It's key to the speed, the tech adoption, political centralization at the top, but crucially, significant economic decentralization further down.
And the local officials, the mayors, play a big part.
A huge part. This is really interesting. The source calls them effective equity stakeholders in their own jurisdictions.
Equity stakeholders. How so?
Well, they have this powerful incentive to back private companies, build up industrial clusters, drive local GDP, create jobs, boost property values.
Because that generates tax revenue locally.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Their success in doing that, in delivering that local growth, is directly tied to their own political promotion prospects within the national system.
So personal career advancement is linked to being pro-business locally.
Precisely. It's a very unusual, very powerful alignment of incentives. It makes local officials champions of growth, often private sector growth, even within this state-led system.
That's a fascinating dynamic.
It is. And the source also mentions it's not always overt. There's a subtler state-private collaboration, too. Like a study looking at millions of firms found these really complex ownership webs where state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are often key nodes connecting private firms. It's not just state versus private.
Okay, so this engine was running hot. Well,
Yeah.
What was the fuel? You mentioned it wasn't just investment, though that was high.
Right. Investment rates were definitely high. But China's approach to reform was different. They called it wading through the river stone by stone.
Gradual, experimental.
Yeah, pragmatic, learn as you go, avoid those massive destabilizing shocks like the shock therapy some former Soviet bloc countries tried.
And the reforms started early, like in agriculture.
Right back in '78, moving away from the old communes, centralized production, that was one of the first big waves.
But the main growth driver wasn't just building stuff.
That's the Tauman assumption, but the research highlighted in the source points somewhere else, somewhere more significant. Total factor productivity, TFP.
TFP, right? That's about efficiency, isn't it?
Right.
Getting more output from the same labor and capital.
Exactly. Working smarter, not just harder, or throwing more money at it. And the data suggests TFP played a bigger role than capital investment in that first huge growth spurt.
Really? More important than all the building and investment.
That's what the research indicates. Between 1978 and 2007, TFP apparently accounted for something like 78% of China's GDP per capita growth. 78%.
Wow.
Yeah. And the average annual TFP growth was way higher than, say, the U.S. historically, or even Korea during its fast growth phase.
So TFP let the economy jump onto a higher growth path.
Pretty much. It helps overcome those diminishing returns you eventually get from just adding more capital. But it's important to add, the source notes that TFP growth did slow down quite a bit after 2009.
Okay, so incredible growth, driven largely by efficiency gains, but the source also calls it a high-cost model. What were the downsides?
There were definitely significant costs. Households, in effect, subsidized a lot of this industrialization. Things like wages kept below market rates, really low returns on savings.
Which skewed the economy towards exports and investment, not consumption.
Exactly, big imbalances. And then you had the environmental toll. Significant degradation, wasted resources.
The rapid construction, maybe cutting corners.
Yeah, sometimes cheaply built housing projects, stories of flooding ancient towns for dams. There was a real growth at all cost feel for a long time.
But that's shifting now in what the source terms the new era.
It seems so. There's definitely a move away from that relentless, single-minded focus on the GDP number. More emphasis on, softer things.
Like clean air, quality of life.
Right. Cleaner environment, food security, just general well-being. The aim seems to be shifting towards a, quote, slower but saner pursuit of growth. More regulated, more orderly.
A recognition that just being economically efficient isn't the whole story.
Yeah, that it also needs to be socially desirable. The source uses this great phrase, striving to move beyond socialism stained by shortages and capitalism stigmatized by inequality.
That really captures the tightrope walk. Okay, let's pivot to the people. Culture, policy. How does that weave into the economic story?
It's absolutely crucial. Chinese culture, especially Confucian values, plays a really interesting role.
How so? Things like stability, hard work.
Yeah, respect for order, social harmony, the work ethic, frugality. This sense of communalism. Plus, the world's oldest tradition of merit-based bureaucracy, that's a Confucian legacy too. Initially, some thought these might hinder capitalism, but now they're often credited in East Asia's success.
And filial piety.
Yeah,
Daoshan.
a huge one. The expectation for children to support their elders. It's not just a norm, it's enshrined in law. And it shapes everything from savings behavior to how families make big decisions together.
The source also mentions this idea of state paternalism, like tiger mom governance.
Right. It can seem very intrusive from a Western viewpoint. But the source suggests there's a kind of broad cultural acceptance, or at least a different framing of it. People balancing obligation and deference with free will.
And surveys show high government approval.
Consistently very high satisfaction with the central government. Much higher confidence levels than you see in many Western countries, according to surveys like the World Values Survey. People seem to expect the government to take a large role. Interventions aren't always seen as infringements on liberty in the same way.
But is there accountability? How does the government stay responsive?
The source argues there are mechanisms, maybe different from Western democratic ones, more government departments with powers to investigate safety, food, environment, anti-corruption.
Sending teams out.
Yeah, dispatching cadres. Environmental inspections, for instance, have disciplined thousands of officials. And there's the complaint system. Physical mailboxes still exist, but also online platforms.
So citizens can report problems.
Exactly. It's apparently a really important source of information for the central government, letting them know what's happening on the ground, bypassing local officials who might want to hide things.
Now, one policy had just immense, perhaps unforeseen, economic ripples. the one-child policy?
Oh, absolutely pivotal. Imposed back in '78 by Deng Xiaoping, the mandate was basically get the population down, figure it out.
And the goal was population control, but the side effects,
Huge, far-reaching, especially economically.
like on savings rates.
A massive impact. China's household savings rate is incredibly high, right?
Oh.
Over 30% versus under 10% in the OECD typically.
Why did the policy drive that?
Well, fewer kids meant less immediate spending, sure, but remember filial piety. A single child now faced the burden of potentially supporting 2 parents and 4 grandparents.
Wow, the pressure.
Immense pressure. Combine that with limited state pensions, especially early on, and general uncertainty. People felt they had to save heavily for old age, for emergencies.
And it channeled investment into that one child, too.
Tremendously. Families poured resources into their single child's education, like 25% of annual income, the source says, compared to maybe 5% in the U.S.
Driven by competition.
Yeah.
Wanting the best for their child.
Absolutely. Intense desire for success, higher wages, competitiveness, making sure your kid got ahead. The data even shows only children were much more likely to pursue academic high school over vocational routes. Tutoring became this national pastime.
And it skewed the gender balance, impacting marriage.
Yeah, particularly in rural areas, more sons than daughters, which then created more pressure for families with sons to save for dowries and housing. Families with daughters saved too, often investing in education to boost their prospects.
This all leads to the new generation post-80s, 90s kids.
Right, a real break from the past. They didn't experience the shortages or the Cultural Revolution firsthand. They grew up under the one-child policy.
It's a different outlook.
Generally, yes. Unprecedented spending power, more consumerist, often described as more optimistic, maybe less risk-averse than their parents.
And maybe less focused solely on wealth.
Yeah, seeking happiness, meaning quality of life seems more prominent. Also, often more socially conscious environment, injustice, global issues, and very proud of China's rise, more focused internally, less automatically looking west for validation or jobs.
Which connects to the returning trend. Students coming back.
Exactly. Decades ago, students going abroad often stayed. Then maybe they returned to Hong Kong. But now, mainland China is the main destination. A huge percentage, like 86% between 2000 and 2019, returned.
Drawn by the opportunities back home.
Absolutely. The dynamism, the startup scene, venture capital, big research budgets, the sense that China is where the action is.
Okay, let's shift to the nuts and bolts. Firms, finance, innovation. The role of private companies seems bigger than many assume.
It really is. The private sector now drives the majority of output, wealth, and especially urban jobs. Over 80% of urban employment. That's a total flip from 30 years ago.
And they did this despite facing hurdles compared to the SOEs.
Yeah, often higher barriers, tougher access to capital, more red tape. But they were simply more productive, grew faster. SOEs, state-owned enterprises, often had other priorities, social goals, national plans. Profit wasn't always number one.
They were foot soldiers for state goals.
Right, like during the 2008 stimulus, building projects, whether they made commercial sense or not, and incentives could be skewed, size or political connections sometimes mattered more than profit.
But the SOEs were reformed, not just privatized wholesale.
Exactly. In the late 90s, they opted for this dual-track system. Reformed SOEs could coexist and compete with private firms. It avoided the chaos and asset-stripping scene in Russia, for example.
It's that anecdote about the melon seed vendor. Fools melon seeds.
Nian Guangjiu, a great early example. He started hiring people, which bumped up against Marxist ideology about exploitation, became a real test case.
And Deng Xiaoping intervened.
Yeah, ultimately gave the green light for him to expand. It was a hugely important signal from the top that private enterprise had a place.
What about foreign firms? A mixed bag, presumably?
Definitely varied experiences since the late 70s. Big names came in: Panasonic, Coke, IBM, Apple, Microsoft. The state was kind of ambivalent, wanted the tech and investment, but worried about the impact on local firms.
Were they subsidized?
Interestingly, the source cites data suggesting that for a time, 1998-2007, foreign manufacturing firms might have actually received more subsidies than SOEs.
And joint ventures. People often hear they fail.
The anecdotes suggest that sometimes, yeah, but the data, surprisingly, indicates that on average, joint ventures actually performed better than wholly owned foreign or domestic firms.
Why would that be?
The combination. Local partner knows the market, the connections. Foreign partner brings tech, capital, maybe better governance. Think McDonald's or the auto industry, Mercedes, BMW, adapting locally.
Yeah.
It requires the G to key, keeping your feet on the ground, really understanding the local context.
Okay, innovation. The source uses a broad definition.
Right, not just the huge breakthroughs, the 0 to 1. It includes significant improvements applying existing things in new ways, from 1 to N.
And China excels at that.
Massively. Think super fast construction building a skyscraper in weeks. Or business model innovations, like integrating purchasing into video streaming, or Pinduoduo's group buying and gamification, or Meituan becoming this super app for everything.
Taking existing ideas and scaling or combining them creatively.
Exactly. And this drives real productivity gains, income growth, and having that enormous domestic market is a massive advantage.
A giant laboratory for testing ideas.
Precisely. Companies like Tuqiao, Alibaba, Tencent learn incredibly fast from hundreds of millions of users. This fueled fintech innovation too, like Ant Group's MY Bank using digital data to give small loans. They even used fintech for targeted support during COVID.
But what about that 0 to 1, the really cutting-edge stuff?
China's catching up fast, but the source suggests the West still generally leads in fundamental breakthroughs, new materials, next-gen communications, basic software, maybe complex semiconductor design.
So good at application, less so at invention.
Historically, perhaps, like generic drugs versus inventing new ones, or deploying green energy tech versus inventing the core technology. The West might lead in, say, AI algorithms, while China excels at implementing AI because of its huge data sets and scale.
And now there's a big push for self-sufficiency.
Yeah, partly driven by external pressures, tech restrictions. This Juguo, or whole nation, approach trying to focus resources on breaking through in those critical throat-choking technologies like advanced semiconductors.
Learning to finance state paternalism shows up here too.
Very much so. Deep cultural and historical roots. It helps explain some things that puzzle outsiders, like the wild stock market swings or the housing market dynamics.
The stock markets, notoriously volatile and often underperform.
Yeah, domestic markets haven't performed that well historically. Listed firms often do worse than unlisted ones, especially the big state-controlled SOEs. The really top Chinese companies often chose to list overseas, which also dragged down domestic market performance.
Why the poor performance? Issues with how companies use the money.
Often, yeah. Poor investment choices after listing, tunneling, where resources get diverted, weird, unrelated acquisitions, like a motorbike company buying a pharma firm, or Evergrande getting into everything. And geopolitical tensions are now making overseas listings harder.
And the housing market. Basically non-existent 25 years ago.
Pretty much. Privatized around 1997, now it's the world's largest asset class. Remember, land is state-owned. Local governments lease the rights to developers.
And that became a huge money spender for local governments.
Massive. Especially after tax reforms in '94 cut other revenue streams. So they had every incentive to lease land, build infrastructure to make it valuable, acting like venture capitalists funding development. Developers then expanded like crazy, using cheap loans, pre-selling apartments, hoarding land.
Evergrande being the poster child for that boom and bust.
Prime example, yeah.
But how did prices get so high? Like 40 times average income in some places.
It's a puzzle. Rental yields are actually quite low, but other investment options weren't great. Low returns on bank deposits, volatile stocks. So property became seen as the safest, best investment.
And the six wallet phenomenon.
Right. Parents and both sets of grandparents chipping in for the down payment. Huge social pressure, too. Property ownership deeply tied to marriage prospects, social status. A survey found most mothers in Shanghai wouldn't want their daughters marrying a non-homeowner.
Resulting in incredibly high homeownership rates.
Over 90% for urban households, one of the highest in the world.
What about those ghost town stories? Ordos, Zhengdong.
The source suggests that narrative can be overblown. Yes, vacancy rates are higher than the U.S., but those specific examples weren't necessarily representative and often captured snapshots of huge developments early on, before people moved in.
But there's still bubble risk, because local governments rely on that land revenue.
Definitely. That reliance created a too-big-to-fail mentality, fueling speculation. Future headwinds are there, though. Aging population, fewer marriages, slowing income growth, plus signals from the state wanting more control.
Shadow banking also played a role.
Yeah, it popped up to get around the rules of the formal banking system. Financial innovation, filling gaps. Banks moved lending off balance sheet, local governments used it to fund projects, people sought higher returns.
It helped fuel the 2008 stimulus response.
It did, but it also meant debt levels shot up significantly across the system.
And China has global financial ambitions now.
Clearly. Promoting the renminbi for trade, letting foreign institutions in more. The central bank provides liquidity swaps to other countries. Getting the RMB into the IMF's SDR basket in 2016 was a big step, and they hold huge amounts of U.S. treasuries.
But the source points to a fragility.
Yeah.
Rigidity causing instability.
Yeah, interventions like capital controls meant to stabilize can sometimes backfire. That massive capital flight in 2015, $1 trillion leaving, showed how quickly things can wobble globally when controls meet pressure.
So the core tension is control versus openness. To be a global anchor, you need openness.
That seems to be the dilemma. Global finance requires flexibility, transparency, trust. China's system has historically prioritized control and stability above all else. They're hard to reconcile.
What about the digital yuan, the ECNY?
Potential for easier global transactions, better monitoring, maybe quicker support in crises, but big privacy trade-offs. Ultimately, whether it gains traction depends on fundamentals and trust. Like the source says, money is trust inscribed.
All this leads to describing China as a systemic emerging market.
It's a good term. Systemic because it's so big, its ripples affect everyone. Emerging because its institutions, its markets are still developing, still carry certain risks. Its deeper integration into global finance could definitely add volatility.
Okay, let's tackle trade. Often seen as a source of friction. Opportunity or threat?
China joining the WTO in 2001 was a watershed moment. The scale, the speed, unprecedented. Its share of global GDP doubled, exports boomed, trade surpluses grew, Chinese firms started buying foreign brands.
But it also caused friction, especially with the U.S. job losses.
Yeah, that became a major political issue. Significant job losses in U.S. manufacturing sectors were linked to import competition from China, maybe 2-3 million between 2000 and 2010.
Though manufacturing decline started earlier.
Right. The source notes that decline predated the China shock, which tended to hit already vulnerable areas hardest.
And the benefits of trade often get less attention.
They really do. Lower prices for consumers, particularly benefiting lower-income families, which actually reduces real income inequality. Plus, it spurred competition and innovation elsewhere. Companies had upped their game.
But there are genuine disagreements about fair trade.
Definitely. Developing countries argue they need tools, subsidies, protection for infant industries that developed countries used historically but are now discouraged by WTO rules. China's complex, being both advanced in some areas and still low income for many, makes it a tricky case.
And the WTO itself needs updating.
Badly. It struggles with modern issues like data, e-commerce, environment, labor, and it really needs the U.S. and China engaged to work properly. Bilateral fights haven't been that effective. The multilateral system is better for resolving disputes.
The source interestingly calls external pressure a gift in disguise for China.
Yeah, using the term Daobijiji like a lock-in that forces positive change. WTO entry pushed China to modernize laws, become more market-oriented. The source even argues China complies better with WTO rulings than the U.S. does. And things like the new law banning forced tech transfer came partly from external pressure. Ultimately, openness helps China too.
What about the trade wars? Do they achieve their stated goals?
Largely no. The U.S.-China trade deficit didn't really shrink much. Imports and exports actually kept rising overall. It turns out it's really hard to just replace China's manufacturing scale, its logistics, its supply chains.
So foreign firms are staying?
Many are. Despite risks, they see China's huge market as essential, a fitness center to keep them competitive, a testing ground for innovation. Look at Tesla doubling down in Shanghai. It really highlights this dynamic: cold politics but hot economics. The rhetoric might be frosty, but the economic interdependence is just incredibly deep. China needs the world needs China. FDI keeps flowing in. Supply chains might shift a bit, but they're not disappearing.
And tackling global threats needs both sides.
Absolutely. Climate change, pandemics. You can't solve those without the U.S. and China on board.
Looking forward then, what are the big hurdles for China's model?
Well, maintaining growth is tougher now. Getting from middle income to high income status, that 10K to 30 MLK per capita jump requires sustained productivity gains, which is hard.
And dealing with capitalism's downsides, inequality, disillusioned youth.
Exactly. China needs to find ways to manage those issues potentially better than traditional free markets have. And the old top-down mobilization system might not be the best fit for everything now.
Not ideal for fostering breakthrough innovation or managing a complex society.
Possibly not. Breakthrough tech often needs more bottom-up experimentation debate. And as society gets more complex, people want diverse needs met, which requires different kinds of responsiveness.
So China's constantly searching for a new equilibrium.
That's how the source puts it. A constant process of learning, adjusting the balance, equality versus incentives, security versus growth, self-reliance versus engagement. It's not always smooth, as the 2022 economic wobble showed. Reputation for stability took a hit.
Which underlines the need for U.S.-China accommodation.
It seems essential, finding ways to cooperate peacefully despite the differences, not just on trade, but on development models, technology, global governance. Recognizing that extreme outcomes like China totally displacing the U.S. or U.S. dominance continuing forever are probably unrealistic. Finding common ground is crucial.
And the whole idea of economic leadership might be changing.
Maybe moving beyond just who has the biggest GDP or the dominant currency. Global challenges cross borders. The future might be less about hegemony and more about sustaining networks, ensuring stability and function so everyone can benefit. Complementarity over pure competition.
What about specific concerns, like the Belt and Road Initiative debt trap claims?
The source argues that's often oversimplified or misleading. Many countries in debt crises owe most to Western lenders, not China. Debt crises aren't new. China has provided relief, written off loans. Actual asset seizures are rare. They've joined G20 debt relief efforts. It reflects a different vision, maybe, focused on shared development alongside geopolitical goals, of course. And there's a point about legitimacy, too. Traditional Western legitimacy based on democracy has faced challenges globally. China's pragmatic, results-focused approach has gained traction in parts of the developing world. Leadership today needs more than just power. It needs a kind of moral resonance.
But ultimately, that interconnectedness remains key.
Absolutely. Despite all the tensions, the economic ties are just too deep, too indispensable right now.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, drawing on Keyu The New China Playbook, we've traced this incredible journey from scarcity to global player.
Driven by this unique hybrid system, the state-market dance, the crucial role of productivity, and shaped so deeply by culture, policy like the one-child rule, and generational shifts.
We've dug into the complexities of the firms, the often puzzling financial system, the unique approach to innovation, and China's massive global trade footprint.
And hopefully reinforce that getting China right means looking past the easy stereotypes, focusing on the evidence, the data, and resisting purely emotional reactions. The author suggests understanding the playbook can actually help lower tensions, make the world safe for diversity.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Given China's ongoing challenges, its unique path, and this growing need for global cooperation, what does this incredibly powerful, paradoxical system really mean for the future of the global economy? And maybe just as important, what lessons the good and the bad, the successes and the cautionary tales should other nations really be learning from China's remarkable, complex, and let's face it, sometimes unsettling journey?